This year, in our Faust Branch meetings of the Anthroposophical Society, we have been working periodically through the year, this past year, on what are known as the Michael letters. These are letters, brief 3 or 4 typewritten page essays about the Archangel Michael. And we can experience that as the culmination of his lifetime of work. It was the earnest calling and commitment of his heart to speak to us, those who were working with anthroposophy, about the importance of the Michael schools, of the being of Michael. And I have the impression that if he could have, he would have taken each one of us by the shoulders and shaken us and looked directly in our eyes and said, "Wake up, we must know this." For him, Michael is the decisive leader of our age, the decisive leader of all of the anthroposophical work. As Rudolf Steiner's work unfolded, he told us that we, probably all of us, had participated in what is called the ritual, the cultus, the Sacramento ceremony that took place in the spiritual world shortly before we were born. I'll speak more of that through the evening, but Rudolf Steiner was wishing that we would all realize, remember, be shocked and shaken, awake, to remember the vision that we brought with us as we incarnated. And out of that we would have the fortitude to work with Ahriman, and as against his encroaching power in this material age. And Rudolf Steiner said, we can see clearly the kind of very difficult struggles that are in store for the human being in the coming years, the coming centuries. But if we have the strength of Michael, we will be able to deal with that in the right way. So with that as a foundation, I would very much like to plunge into this lecture and tell you so many of the things that I have been immersing myself in studying in preparation for this talk about the relationship of Christ and Michael. I'll begin by reading this thought from the Michael letters, right from the very first of the essays that Rudolf Steiner wrote. Hearts are beginning to have thoughts. To grasp this is to receive Michael into one's inner being. Thoughts that aim to understand matters of the spirit in our time must spring from hearts devoted to Michael as the fiery cosmic lord of thought. And what is striking about this is that most of us experience that our center of thinking is in the head. And in a few minutes, I'll speak about this, how the center of thinking in centuries long past was the human heart, but it was a different kind of thinking that we have now. And then a few centuries ago, the hierarchies, as they prepared to make us free thinkers, independent thinkers, changed our entire human constitution so that our brain, our neurological system, is now experiences a center of thought. But with Michael as the active time spirit now, we are called upon to weigh all of our thoughts in our hearts, there where the light of Christ is working powerfully. We see then, as Rudolf Steiner's, in the last years of Rudolf Steiner's work, how so much more of his activity dealt with these Michael mysteries, as I said a moment ago. We see the Michael letters. We can also see powerfully the foundation stone meditation, which we can understand as a truly free esoteric deed in the name of Michael that Rudolf Steiner created. Also the Karma letters, the Karma lessons. Rudolf Steiner gave many lectures in those last years of his life. And it was especially important, and particularly in the latest Karma lectures, that he talked to people about the pre-earthly experiences that they had had with Michael. In fact, of all of the incarnations that many of us have had, being students of Michael in different situations. And of course, in the first class, the esoteric lessons of those who have made a deep commitment to anthroposophy, we have a direct expression of the teachings of Michael. And yes, this also includes the Christian community. And I have read that the epistle, the words that are spoken in the Christian community service at Michaelmas, were the last words that Rudolf Steiner handed to the priests to complete the legacy or the words that he had to give to them. And this was a very interesting situation that Rudolf Steiner was lamenting that the anthroposophists weren't working well enough with community. And one of the priests said to him, maybe there's something that could be put into being, brought into being through the Christian community. Rudolf Steiner said, no, the time's not right for that now. But it was really only shortly that afterwards, it stands in the book that I was reading, that Rudolf Steiner came to this priest and to the circle of priests joyfully and said, I have it now. It was given to me. These are the words that Michael brings to the Christian community. So that's a wonderful, powerful, inspiring lesson. So I will soon trace for you a whole journey through Rudolf Steiner's life, how in the beginning of his work, he joined himself with the Theosophical community because the Theosophical Society initially was still quite connected to Rosicrucianism. But as it began to turn its interest more towards the East, Rudolf Steiner severed his connection to the Theosophical Society, and he began to, from that point on, speak more and more about Michael. So we'll speak a bit more about that in a few minutes. But I'd like to turn now and start looking at other questions, beginning with who is Michael? Michael was, until our time, an archangel. He is now ascended, but we'll come to that in a moment. And there are many things that we can say about the archangels. They are spirits of folks, of the nations. They were the guiding spirits of the Jewish people, for instance, the Hebrew people. And the archangel, 7 of these lofty beings, alternate as time spirits for about 350 years, each of them. Michael's last previous regency as a time spirit was at the time of Alexander and Aristotle, back before Christ's incarnation. And now this one is his first regency since the incarnation of Christ, and is a very important one. The spiritual hierarchies all have different constitutions than human beings do. And an angelic being has his lowest body, if we call it a body, in the etheric world. And an archangel has his lowest body in the astral world. So when we think of these archangels holding the world, we find them in the astral sphere. The archai have their lowest body, outermost body, as an ego. And that becomes particularly interesting soon, as we'll look at the fact that Michael has now become an archai being. He's ascended, if you will. Now, for the next step, I'd like to give credit to Sergei Prokopiev in his book about the Holy Sophia. And when he's speaking about Sophia as the goddess, if you will. I have to say many things, but the whole being that contains the hierarchies of the Kuryotites and of other hierarchies. Prokofiev tells us, in what I find a very helpful way, that when a spiritual being is called female, it's because that spiritual being encompasses many other beings and is not a solo individuated being. And as the head of the Kuryotites, the Sophionic being includes all the Kuryotites, but her being grows down to all other beings who are developing the ego. And that means in our time that her being now has descended to encompass also the human being. So when we trace our human relationship to Sophia, we'll see that she was honored in Philosophia, Theosophia, and now Anthroposophia, as we strive to grow upwards towards her. Now, going back into occult science, staying with Prokofiev, Prokofiev tells us that in the Michael, in the Russian church, it is said that Michael was the firstborn of the archangels. And then he unwraps the story, which I'd like to share for a moment here, that he says, and we know this from occult science, that it was the archangels who achieved their ego stage on ancient sun, which was created out of the Kuryotites. The Kuryotites, the spirits of wisdom, Sophia's domain. And so, says Rudolf Steiner, ancient sun was a dark body initially. Outward light hadn't started to shine yet. But as the Kuryotites spread their wisdom-filled being out into the space, those beings who were recipients of that light began to feel it raying towards them. And it is said, Steiner says, Michael, no, this was the Russian Orthodox Church, Michael was the first one who became conscious of that light, the light of wisdom coming towards him. And in awakening, Michael said, I know that I am, because I am being shone upon by the original light, by the light of the world. I am. And with him then, other beings awoke, but that moment of the I am from the archangels is what created the light of the universe, the light of worlds. It's very important. And then Rudolf Steiner goes on in the Michael letters to say, as Michael in this light perceived the wisdom of the creative beings, he also saw the other beings who were created, including the angels, who at that time were just at the level of the animals, and including the humans, who were just at the level of plants. And Rudolf Steiner says in a very endearing way, Michael noticed in some corner of the universe, there was something like the human being coming into being in some remote corner. And Michael resolved that these human beings, that's us, he would do his best to be sure that we always stayed in relationship to Sophia, to the original light, to cosmic wisdom. So with that, we have laid the foundation for why Michael is committed to bringing cosmic wisdom, cosmic intelligence to us. But then it goes one step further, because Rudolf Steiner speaks very beautifully about how Michael's service to this wisdom is completely selfless, serving, devoted, and dedicated. And he said this wisdom was destined to become free for human beings so that we would go through our ego stage to become free individuals. And then he says, powerful sentence, if there happened to be another being at the same level of consciousness, at the same rank as Michael, who was also able to perceive this cosmic intelligence becoming free, then that being would be able to take that freed cosmic intelligence and do something else with it. And then, continues Steiner, and such a being existed, and that being was Ahriman. Ahriman is also an archangel, and he sets himself entirely at odds with the work of Michael. So Michael has directed his gaze towards humanity from the beginning. And, as Rudolf Steiner says, here's a quote, Michael counts it as his deepest satisfaction that through the agency of the human being, through us, he has succeeded thus far in keeping the starry world directly connected, united with the divine spiritual. Stars and all that they are corrected to us. Directly connected between the movements of the stars and man's life on earth. I ask myself, what happens now that we have artificial insemination and so on? That is getting shunted somehow. Rudolf Steiner goes on and says, this is interestingly phrased, what the gods undergo as their evolution in the course of separating intellectuality from their cosmic function in order to embody it in human nature. This is a cosmic fact open to observation. Once again, what's so interesting to me is he speaks about what the gods themselves undergo as their evolution in the course of separating intellectuality from their cosmic function. That's a fact open to observation. And from there, he builds the thought that Ahriman gets involved in this. And he says, if Ahriman were to succeed in taking this intellectuality and severing it from the cosmic wisdom, human beings would have to forfeit the Christ. Forfeit the Christ. And this whole created world that we are so privileged to live in, this whole situation that we go through would become a machine, cold and mechanical. We would be trapped in the thoughts of our own making and no longer find our way to spirit after death. Does that mean that's certainly a very real possibility? We can tell now with the mechanization of thoughts in all of our dead thinking, to the extent that we don't really enliven thinking through our hearts. This is not to say that we need to be Luddites. In fact, we have a great deal to thank the machine world for, and that is something that we're going to be working with for millennia into the future. As the physical world becomes denser and denser, we shall have to call upon the help of the machine world, but that doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice our soul to it. But we will lose it if we don't enliven our thinking. I'll continue. And now I'll look at Michael's relationship to Christ. He says, in serving our evolution, Michael must fight the battle that I have indicated against Ahriman, so that he, the Christ, does not appear in a wrong form. That is to say, a merely subjective imagination on the path of humanity. But so that Christ appears in the right image. We really need to see Christ and not some distortion of what he is. We'll work more towards that as we go forth. And so we have to see Christ is and has been for long ages the spirit dwelling in the Son. However, we can also understand that he comes from a much higher region than from just the sun in our solar system. He comes from lofty heights, those heights beyond the stars, and has come to live in the sun. And then from there, he gradually has embodied himself in the guidance of earthly mankind. So let me turn the page here and keep going. So we have a picture that Michael also has been dwelling in the sun, and he carries, as Rudolf Steiner says, everything about Michael has to do with the light. In fact, even in the foundation stone meditation, where we speak about Christ's light, divine sun, Christ's sun, divine light, even that is permeated with Michael's light. When Christ was in the sun before his incarnation, he was there directly with Michael and many other beings who felt allegiance, who are connected with that being of Michael. And these beings had to experience, as Christ descended into this earthly realm to take on human form, that he is leaving us. And in many places, I found this sentence quoted: he is leaving us. What will we do? Michael had to experience how all that he had administered from the beginning of cosmic intelligence and creative deeds and how the spiritual beings work, all of that was descending with Christ towards the earth. And this was a consequence of the mystery of Golgotha. And this was obviously a cosmic gift to earthly humanity, a gift of great love. And Michael, seeing Christ descend, resolved to follow, essentially saying, the greatest being of all has left the sun, united himself with the earth. My task is to serve that. And so now I have to give over intelligence, cosmic intelligence, the capacity to think. I have to give that over to the earth, to human beings. No longer will human beings simply receive living thoughts from the spiritual world. Human beings are going to have to think for themselves. And so gradually, Michael let the thought descend. So we'll come back to that in just a moment here. So Michael, as he let this intelligence fall, Rudolf Steiner says, the intelligence as it came to the earth didn't happen right away, but in the 8th and the 9th century, this intelligence fell like sacred rain onto the earth. And as it came into human minds, humans began to think, thoughts aren't divine. I'm the one who thinks. It's coming from me, myself. So this then was all in preparation for the consciousness soul that we're living in now. Human beings, now I quote again, human beings were certain that they no longer received their thoughts from the spiritual world, but they perceived them on their own. They were creators of their own thoughts and could now grasp their thoughts in freedom. Now, here's an interesting thought, probably come back to it a bit. But the thoughts that we live in are lifeless shadows of reality, unless we can find the life behind them. And we learn that much of this is involved with our relationship to Ahriman, because Ahriman's deed, since the fall, the Garden of Eden, Ahriman has taken on an unrightful relationship to our physical body. We need the physical body to experience our I, that's a lawfulness that's existing now. And Michael, by solidifying the physical body so much, has imprinted in it the gesture, the signature of death. And this relationship means that dead thoughts, our I is receiving just the lifeless shadows of thought by being immersed in this kingdom of death. There's no way about that. And that's what they create the foundation for our experience of freedom. That had to happen that way. So now another way of saying what happened is Christ, the Spirit of the Son, came down from the earthly worlds, so the spirit worlds, so that what has humanly come out of the supersensible worlds, that's the freedom and the intellectuality, will unite with what has cosmically come out. So what descends cosmically into the earth and what descends humanly into the earth are able to unite because Christ brings the resurrecting forces into this dead world that we live in. So through anthroposophy and the mystery of Golgotha, what is most holy for us can be permeated by the Christ impulse, namely the faculty to grasp pure concepts and the faculty of freedom. This is how our human work as the 10th hierarchy is going to be built, if we can get through the eye of this needle. And it is Michael who offers us this gift. So I'll turn back to Michael now. He prepared for his upcoming regency, which began in 1879, is this current age where he is the archangel of our time. He prepared for this by creating the super sensible Michael school for 300 years, preceding 1879. How did he teach in that Michael school? He gathered in the spiritual world around himself the students who were to carry this impulse of building the 10th hierarchy into the future. Those who surrounded him included angelic beings, archangelic beings, also elemental beings. And here we call upon very specifically the elemental beings who are spoken about in the Foundation Stone meditation. And also the highest human initiates. For 300 years, they heard his teachings and they could perceive Michael preparing his journey on the earth. So here I'll quote again from Rudolf Steiner. He said this: in the school, Michael spoke to his listeners, both human beings and higher beings, about world relationships, cosmic relationships, and anthroposophical relationships. The instruction was given as a mighty imaginative cultus. So not yet the cultus which was done later, but an imaginative cultus, pictures, and human beings who participated were karmically predestined for it, to prepare anthroposophy in superhuman relationships. That was many or all of us. Yeah? The content of the school was, says Rudolf Steiner, the cognitions of anthroposophy, the nature of the human being, cosmic evolution, the hierarchies, the forming of karma, the history of humanity, in fact, everything that is in occult science. And thereby occult science is the truly Michaelic study. There, like the very midpoint of this evolution, the Christ being places himself into the entire tableau of reincarnation, the nature of humanity, the contemplation of the cosmos, and so on. And if we consider this anthroposophical worldview in the proper sense, we can say to ourselves, I can look at it all, but I can only comprehend it when the entire picture indicates for me the mighty center, the Christ. Says Steiner, I have portrayed the teaching of reincarnation through different images. The teacher concerning the human races, the planet's evolution, and so on. But here, from one point, I have painted the nature of the Christ. And in that way, light spreads out over everything else. It is a picture containing a main figure with everything else relating to it. And I only understand the significance and expression of any of the other figures when I understand this main figure. This is how it is with the anthroposophical worldview. We design a huge picture concerning the various sets of facts regarding the spiritual world. But then we look at the main figure, at the Christ. And only then do we understand all the details of the picture. So Rudolf Steiner writes this somewhat later in his teaching, but it's very important. And I'll continue here. As Michael was sending this cosmic intelligence down to the earth, following the descent of Christ, he made it available to the greatest degree to the human beings who were emancipating themselves. But they were unprotected by the mystery centers that had been safeguarding mystery knowledge since the beginning of time. And Rudolf Steiner said, Michael was fully aware of the attendant dangers that would bring. And he knew that it would be many centuries until the next era of his regency, and that faithful things might happen in earthly engagement with the forces of intelligence towards Michael, although human beings were not completely in danger or vulnerable until the beginning of the consciousness soul age. But there were special centers where the Michaelic knowledge was being cultivated amongst the Platonists, and the Aristotelians, and the Dominicans, among Christian Rosenkreuz and his community, to name a few. But as Rudolf Steiner describes this, Michael experienced heavenly loneliness as he gave his lessons in the 15th century. He had no tangible means of working on the earth because it wasn't his time. And he instructed those who belonged to his community, the angels and archangels and elemental beings and humans, in lessons that would be of outstanding importance for the work in the earth, with the love that encompassed the cosmic sun space. Pictures that were, said Steiner, wondrously grandiose in mighty universal worlds that penetrated this community gathered in the spiritual world as inner teachings of the heart. And these were not just the old teachings, these were the teachings that were building the future of humanity. You and I need these, and our act of service as students of Michael, of Christ Michael, so that we can help serve the development of humanity towards the 10th hierarchy and help the cosmic intelligence that our world doesn't fall into a machine. So we'll go a little bit further now. I want to talk for a moment about the changing of the human constitution. So we must consider that Michael has been linked with our incarnation process since the beginning of our earth. Michael is the builder of the human form, actually, in that our form carries wisdom. So Michael creates the wisdom of this form, even though Ahriman has given it the sting of death. And he created it as it is subject to birth and to death. He was involved in the situation around the fall, and also to gender. And by being connected with gender, we have a very interesting point, because we know that the creation of gender had the result that the human being would be able to think. Before the separation into two genders, human being had to use procreating and receptive forces within one body to be able to create an offspring. And with the separation to two sexes, two individualities had to complement each other to be able to procreate. And it was that then freed certain forces of consciousness so that we would think. So the gesture polarity came about through that. And as polarities came about, it meant the other tricky polarity also showed up. And this opponent is called the dragon or the snake. So now, at the beginning of the 15th century, the beginning of the consciousness soul age, the spiritual beings could see what was ahead, what was coming. Humans would learn to think independently. And there, in tremendously mighty pictures, Rudolf Steiner says that the first hierarchy, the seraphim and the cherubim and the thrones, reconstituted the human being. They conducted earthly powers of intelligence fully into the human being's neurosensory system, a process that Rudolf Steiner described as one surrounded by mighty storms of thunder and lightning. And this caused a reconfiguration of the neurosensory system. And now we began to think with the heads. The Ahrimanic beings were tremendously alarmed by that because they had their, if you will, their plot to do something else. And they launched intense resistance to counter the spread of the cosmic Michael school. And precisely in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries into the 18th, he said Michael's hosts ascended with demonic spiritual vapor, and they aimed to encompass these forces of human intelligence that have now become free since the beginning of the consciousness soul age. This crisis obviously continues today. And says Rudolf Steiner, quote, to be an anthroposophist means, among other things, to understand this battle, at least to some degree. The danger exists that the general intelligence possessed by all human beings can be utilized, not by Michael, but in the Ahrimanic direction. And each of us is free in that. Michael is not allowed to, as a cosmic lawfulness, not allowed to impact our human freedom in any way. Ahriman, with his deviousness, doesn't play by that game. He can do as he wants to with it, and Michael has to wait to see. If Ahriman should win the human beingness, the entelechie, the human thinking, feeling, and willing would all be distorted. And Sergei Prokofiev gives us this one. The loss of morality and thinking gives rise to the amoral. This will be evident in those who work with artificial intelligence, for instance. Feeling, if it loses its connection to Ahriman and Christ, or to Michael and Christ, feeling becomes evil. Intelligence falls into perversity. The Asuras are involved in this. And Steiner says, less and less will there be protection in the world against Ahriman's influence, outside the forces that stream out from the Christ mystery. And then into the will, like in so many things we find, including National Socialism, things like that, we see everywhere these perversions in the will. People will be possessed with, they will lose the good conscience in their will. And we'll see the arising of cold-blooded intellect and criminality, the forces of the sun demon, Surat. And finally, if all that is to take place, the human being will cease to be human, lose connection to the Christ. So I turn again to speak of Christ. There was the first crucifixion at Golgotha, where Christ went through death, connected fully with a human being, and went through death, and created out of that the resurrection body. So the body that Christ incarnated in, Rudolf Steiner calls the religion of the gods. Beautiful, beautiful words, where he says, the gods, beholding our earth, see as the aim of their creation, they have in mind the ideal of the human being. It is that human ideal that certainly is not expressed in the way the physical man is now, but the way the most sublime soul spiritual life could come to expression in the perfectly developed potentials of the physical human being. This is our threefoldness, body, soul, and spirit, all that we are. As a goal, the highest ideal, the religion of divinity, the gods have in mind an image of humanity, as though on the distant shore of divine existence, there hovers it before the gods, the temple, which as the most sublime accomplishment by the gods presents the replica of the divine image of the human being. Surely, if we reach the goal that has been vouchsafed us, we'll be quite different than we are right now. We won't have flesh and blood, but the phantom body, the redeemed body, has now been created by Christ's deed of love. And this redeemed phantom body that was in danger of being forever destroyed by Ahriman, this resurrection body is now available for all human beings who seek it to access. And out of that, we will have the possibility of allowing not just our own personal I am to be present, but the Christ I, when we say through Christ, I receive my humanity. The first crucifixion. And then Rudolf Steiner tells that in, I believe it was the last century, there was another crucifixion. And that was the second death of Christ, the death in the etheric world. In the etheric world where Christ became a radiant presence after the resurrection, in communion with the angels. But Christ, through our materialistic thought forms, we served to darken this thoughts, this life space of Christ in the etheric world. A deep tragedy, the second crucifixion of Christ. And Rudolf Steiner works that thought and said it was necessary for there to be another death on the etheric realm in order that there could be a resurrection in the etheric realm. Christ worked his way through the death in the angelic realm in order that now he can reappear in the etheric world. And so now that brings us to what Rudolf Steiner said will happen in the 1930s, the reappearance of Christ in the etheric. Christ is now the all-pervading presence in the etheric world, the presence of the Spirit Son on the earth. It's everywhere present and available. And in the Christian community service, there's this one short line, Christ's light is in our daylight. And as we know from the foundation stone, he pervades especially human thinking with light, the human heart with warmth. Michael now is ready for the reappearance of Christ in the etheric. And so as the end of the 19th century, just before Michael took on his regency, 1879, he had a pre-earthly cosmic ritual. All of the thoughts that he had taught in the supersensible school now were played out in a ritual event. Michael drew very close to the earth with those who were his students, the highest initiates, and those who were in the brotherhood of Christ Michael students. And before them, the whole ritual pictures of the whole evolution of humanity were imprinted into the etheric world. Some performed this ritual, some other students and listeners listened to the imaginations that profoundly marked theirs, our entire being, all the way into the will, like the sending of the apostles at Whitsun. This is what we all experienced, and this is what Michael wants us to remember. I'm going to take another step here. I hope you still have enough strength for this, and speak inspired by the work of Prokofiev and Peter Selk and others, Steiner as the first Michael initiate. So as we are all, if we have read of Rudolf Steiner's biography, we know that he was already familiar with supersensible experiences by age 8. And then he learned geometry, and he said, that's so perfectly clear to think in geometry. And he said to himself, I knew that the human being must carry knowledge of the spiritual world within himself. Rudolf Steiner in 1879 has his first moon node, which is always a moment of meeting with pre-earthly intentions in the ego. There, he was ready to meet Michael, even as Michael approached the earth to take on his regency. And now we have a very important part here, that Michael becomes or ascends from being merely, so to speak, an archangel to become a time spirit, an archai. And what's essential here is that archais have their lowest body as the ego. And so the meeting with Michael as a time spirit is the meeting of egoic forces. And when we have a true meeting with Michael, it has to be out of our ego forces. Whereas when we meet with the angels, it needn't necessarily be that awakened yet because they're in the etheric world. That's as far as I'll go with that one. But Michael is approaching the earth, and Rudolf Steiner at the same time is working on thinking. And he wants to forfeit his inborn clairvoyance and learn to really think. And he wanted to let me read what Rudolf Steiner wrote here in his Course of My Life, in his autobiography. I now worked more and more consciously on pouring the direct observation I had in the spiritual world into form of thoughts. So work that thought a little bit. Rudolf Steiner could see the spiritual world, but there's another step to understand it and make it into a thought. It's important to think that one through. Observations to make them into thoughts. His question was, how can thinking be transformed in such a way that it no longer kills or destroys spiritual perceptions, but illuminates them in such a way that the human being can participate quite freely and with a strong eye consciousness with the events and processes of the spiritual world? How can the human being become a conscious co-worker among spiritual beings? And above all, with the new time spirit, So as I move through this a little bit quickly, we know that Rudolf Steiner met a spiritual teacher who gave him a key for his life's work. And he told him that he was going to have to fight the dragon of public opinion, which was being increasingly Armanized. We read that Rudolf Steiner, when he lived in Weimar, spoke about in his spiritual experiences. He had to witness the battle that Michael had to do with Ahriman. When Steiner was living in Weimar, he had to witness Michael meeting Ahriman. And then with that, he heard the mighty cosmic questions that lived in Michael's spirit realm about the future of humanity, us. Rudolf Steiner, as we all know, was a prolific student of the sciences. He studied probably every science there was to study, also the arts, philosophy, religion, trying always to exercise the capacity for the intellect and spiritualize it. Within the course of that time, then he wrote The Philosophy of Freedom, 1894, and sometime right in that phase, he had his first conscious meeting with Michael as a modern, I-endowed human being. And he wrote of this: by living outside the physical world with the intellectual or sentient soul, one can live in the sphere in which Michael was just entering earthly life. So Rudolf Steiner wanted to teach all of us how to do that. He worked with thinking and wanted to develop a methodology for evolving linear thinking into living thinking. So this is a really beautiful picture here. Rudolf Steiner says, tells all of us, study natural science as much as you can. And now talking to the Theosophist or the Rosicrucianist, he said, study it according to how you have been taught to study deeply. Study Hegel and Darwin with all of its materialism. Study it and let yourself be penetrated by the methods of cognition that you've learned in knowledge of higher worlds. Learn all that can be learned through external natural science, and then, important, bring it towards the gods. And there you will receive from the gods as an answer, as a metamorphosis, the conversation, you will receive from the gods what is narrated in the book Occult Science. The same thing with religion and so on. So Steiner was working on inverting his thinking, turning it inside out with science and art and religion, and then offer it up to the gods. They then handed back to him what they had received from humanity. They gave it back as anthroposophy. This kind of spirituality is completely new and unknown by the gods. They have a powerful interest in it and they need it, but they can only receive it from human beings who, like Rudolf Steiner, can think and turn natural science inside out. And many of you know how Steiner talks so much about inversions, the process of inversions. We work then from linear thinking, rational thinking, into etheric, morphological thinking. And once we get into this morphological thinking, changing, for instance, thinking of how a cocoon gives rise to a butterfly. With this, he says, we come into the vicinity already of living thinking of Michael. But if we can actually turn it inside out, we meet the being of Michael. And through that, Raphael, Rudolf Steiner shows us the direct path to Michael. And this is necessary so that we can take our place as the 10th hierarchy with what proceeds out of our thrice transformed thinking. So, Rudolf Steiner, continuing with him for a little bit more, he said that he had to go into the dragon, and he told Edward Charest that in a conversation, that he was ready and willing to slip into the skin of the dragon. And in his book, The Course of My Life, Steiner writes, I had to save my spirit viewing in inner tempests. There were storms of spirit in the soul, but I had perceived the Michael power in my heart. And so I sought to discover the possibility of discovering within the Ahrimanic sphere the new Michael path to Christ. Once again, let me take you through this. This is kind of an important one. We will all be led into the sphere of Michael. That's the journey in our time. We will all be led into the sphere of Michael. And into the sphere of Ahriman, I mean to say, and with the help of Christ, with the presence of Christ, let me do this one again. We will all be led into the sphere of Ahriman, and with the help of Michael, we will find that the Christ is even there in the dead intellectuality. Michael guides the human being to the cosmic abyss of non-being. He takes us to the abyss. And there the human being must dare the leap over the abyss. And on the other side, we find the Christ who has always been there. And we can receive the spiritual eye. Rudolf Steiner stated categorically that the essence of the anthroposophy and the Michaelic mission was still slumbering and dreaming in the secret chambers of the heart. And he said, Michael needs hosts of helpers. One last step forward, but he needs our help. So in the Karma lectures, Rudolf Steiner talks about Christ has become the Lord of karma. And with Michael's help, we can take a new step in building karma with other people and making atonement for misdeeds that we make in such a way that they will always benefit the whole of humanity. This is Michael's and Christ's gift to us in the realm of karma. So we have just a little bit longer here. We have to look at the great gift of sacrifice that beings always must go through. Self-sacrifice, to invert themselves, if you will, and give what they have. We have to say, are we not beholding that with Rudolf Steiner's incredible gift of everything that he had in every way? This high initiate laid himself at our feet, and in the end, united his karma with the Anthroposophical Society. He bears with us our human karma. What are we doing with that? I'll read again from Rudolf Steiner. Michael's impulses are strong and powerful, and they work from out of spiritual realms through the entire human being. They work into the spiritual, then from there into the soul element, and from there into our bodily element. He can do that as an archai because he has his I consciousness, Michael. In the spirit human stage, so the Atma stage, he can work from there into the physical world. Now the spirit of courage is Michaelic courage. The courage that never compromises with anything Ahrimanic. Rudolf Steiner says that. We must not compromise with anything Ahrimanic. We must always make way for the will of Christ himself. So as we draw this to a close, we read, Rudolf Steiner says, the first Michael revelation was, the Word became flesh. Now, the flesh must become spirit. The human flesh must again become spirit pervaded. This is the resurrection body, so that it becomes capable of dwelling in the kingdom of the Word in order to behold the divine secrets. Thus, beginning in our time, the path to spirit self, life spirit, and spirit man, spirit human, becomes accessible. We are entering in Christ by accessing the cosmic Christ eye. We are accessing the cosmic age of spirit human being. The earth can only make possible the development of the eye for the human being. But the earth can only make this possible, but Christ can lead us to spirit, self, life spirit, and the spirit human being. Faith in Christ makes us completed. Continuing Rudolf Steiner's words, just as a resurrection body can serve as a mirror image on the microcosmic level in the human being for the replica of the Christ eye, so in future time, the whole earth will play this role in the macrocosm when, through the work of human beings, it will have reached the highest stage of its spiritualization. I should read that again, that's a big one. Just as a resurrection body can serve as a mirror image on the microcosmic level in the human being for the replica of the Christ eye, so in future times, the whole earth will play this role in the macrocosm when, through the work of the human being, the earth will have reached the highest stage of its spiritualization. Then, as the cosmic body of the Christ, it will become the perfect expression of his macrocosmic sun eye that was once the spiritual center of the sun, a center that was the necessary condition for the union of the earth with the sun. And that's the goal of the Michael string. Now, we must not conclude without looking at the importance of community, because Rudolf Steiner, as he spoke and wrote to us, he said, it's essential that we come together as a community. We must collaborate and cooperate. We have this common work together to spiritualize the earth. And I think we all have to welcome how many impulses are arising in our national and international anthroposophical work to talk about the reverse cultus, to talk about our relationship to one another, to build communities, and not in a sentimental way, but in a way that are really dedicated to the working of Christ. And Rudolf Steiner writes this, human beings must arrive at an esoteric maturity and thereby become able to think concretely and be able to think again in festivals, the Michael festivals. It is no longer appropriate to merely consider esoteric descriptions of things. Today, it is necessary for people once again to act and to do esoterically. If the goodwill and the intention to create a new connection to Michael could rise up in great and wide circles, so that such an imagination could be lifted to a religious power and inscribed in the feeling life of every soul, then we would have something that once again would inwardly inscribe itself in the living feelings of the human beings. That which is initially an act of intellectual beholding would become a religious inwardness and a religious deepening. Michael festivals will only have meaning if we become able to awaken to such a living beholding in our souls. So as we draw to a close now, let us remember the foundation stone meditation, which, as actually it was Prokofiev who said, as Rudolf Steiner gave everything that he had understood on the earth, even the pain of the fire of the Goetheanum, as he offered that all to the spiritual world, the spiritual world gave back to him and to us the supersensible foundation stone of love. And we must never underestimate the sacred divinity of that verse and what it is for us as a meditative path. And I want to then also take one last step and speak the words of the Michael verse that Rudolf Steiner gave when he gave his very last lecture, the day before he fell weak at the end of the lecture, withdrew to his sick bed, and remained there for the rest of his life, many months, and from there wrote the Michael letters. And he wrote these words, and he said, this must be, Michael appears and points to us what must now take place. Must be that he has a Michael garment of light. And this garment of light will be the waves of the words that are Christ words, and the word of worlds that can transform the logos of worlds into the logos of humanity. And so he says, Rudolf Steiner, this meditative verse for Michael. Springing from powers of the sun, radiant spirit powers, blessing all worlds, you are predestined by thought divine for Michael's garment of age, of rays. I'm going to pause here for a second because he's speaking. Radiant spirit powers full of light. These are the angels and the archangels and the elemental beings who were part of that pre-earthly ritual. So I'll read it again. Springing from powers of the sun, radiant spirit powers, blessing all worlds, ye are predestined by thought divine for Michael's garment of praise. He, the Christ messenger, revealeth in you, bearing mankind aloft, the sacred will of worlds. You, this is especially the angels, you, the radiant beings of ether worlds, bear the Christ word to man. Thus shall the herald of Christ appear to the thirstily waiting souls, to whom your word of light shines forth in cosmic age of spirit human Atma. You, the disciples of spirit knowledge, take Michael's wisdom beckoning. Take the word of love of the will of worlds into your souls aspiring actively.